The doors of Ellison Hall burst open with a force that made every candle flame shiver, and 200 guests turned as one toward the sound. Nora Ellison froze behind the pillar where she had been hiding, her heart slamming against her ribs, because she already knew who had arrived before she ever saw his face. Duke Alden Blackwood did not walk into a room. He entered it the way a storm enters a harbor, without asking permission, without slowing down, and without a single person daring to look away. He was tall, dressed in deep gray and black, and his eyes carried a coldness that people in the capital whispered about in hushed, frightened tones. They called him the Iron Duke, not because he wore armor, but because no one had ever seen him smile, cry, or show the slightest crack of warmth. Tonight, he had come to choose a bride, and everyone in the hall believed they already knew who it would be. Victoria Ellison stood at the center of the room, in a gown of pale gold, her dark hair pinned with pearls, her chin lifted with the practiced confidence of a woman who had been told her entire life that she was destined for greatness. Her mother, Margaret Ellison, stood beside her, gripping her daughter's hand so tightly her knuckles had turned white with excitement. Edmund Ellison, the family patriarch, cleared his throat and stepped forward to greet the Duke with the kind of smile men wear when they believe a fortune is about to fall into their laps. "Your Grace," Edmund said, bowing low, "we are honored beyond words that you have chosen to grace our home tonight. My daughter Victoria has waited her whole life for a match worthy of her." The Duke did not answer right away. His gaze moved slowly across the ballroom, over the glittering chandeliers, over the nervous smiles of noble families hoping to catch his attention, over Victoria herself, who dropped into a graceful curtsy calculated to the inch. His eyes did not stop on her. They kept moving, searching, as if looking for something the rest of the room could not see. Nora tried to shrink further behind the pillar. She was wearing an old gray dress, mended twice at the hem, because new gowns were reserved for Victoria alone. Her hair was pulled back plainly, no pearls, no ribbons, nothing to draw the eye. She had learned years ago that the safest place in any room was the shadow, and she intended to stay there until the ceremony ended and she could slip back to the kitchen where she belonged. But the Duke's eyes found her anyway. For one terrible moment, his cold gaze locked onto hers, and Nora forgot how to breathe. She had never spoken to him. She had never even been formally introduced to nobility of his rank. Why was he looking at her as if she were the only person in the entire hall? "Your Grace?" Edmund said again, his smile faltering slightly as the silence stretched too long. "Shall I present my daughter properly?" The Duke finally spoke, and his voice was low, even, and utterly without warmth. "There are 2 daughters in this house, are there not?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret's smile cracked at the edges. Victoria's curtsy wavered. "There is my daughter, Victoria," Edmund said carefully, "and my late wife's daughter, Nora. She is little more than a servant in this household, Your Grace. Not worth your attention. Bring her forward," the Duke said. A murmur rippled through the crowd, spreading outward like a wave. Guests turned to search for the girl in question, and Nora felt dozens of eyes land on her hiding place at once. Her stomach twisted into a hard knot. This had to be some kind of mistake, or worse, some kind of cruel trick arranged to humiliate her in front of the entire city. "Your Grace," Margaret said quickly, stepping in front of her husband with a forced laugh. "Surely you misspoke. My Victoria is the finest young woman in this province. She plays the violin beautifully, she speaks 3 languages, and she has been trained since birth to run a great household. Nora is unfortunate. She was never meant for society." "I did not ask for her qualifications," the Duke replied, his tone flat and final. "I asked that she be brought forward." There was no arguing with a voice like that. Edmund's jaw tightened, and he turned toward the pillar where his stepdaughter stood trembling. "Nora," he said through his teeth, "come here at once." Every step Nora took across that polished floor felt like walking across thin ice. She could feel the weight of every stare, could hear the whispers hissing behind raised fans, could see Victoria's face shifting from confusion to something sharper, something dangerous. When Nora finally stopped a few feet from the Duke, she kept her eyes low, too afraid to meet his gaze again. "Look at me," he said. She lifted her chin, forcing herself to hold his stare even though her whole body wanted to run. Up close, his eyes were a deep, unreadable gray. like storm clouds that refused to break. There was no cruelty in them, but there was no softness either. Just a strange, quiet intensity that made her feel as though he were reading something written beneath her skin. "What is your name?" he asked. "Nora, Your Grace, Nora Ellison." "Nora Ellison," he repeated, as if testing the shape of the words. Then he turned to the crowd, and his voice rose just enough to carry to every corner of the hall. "I came here tonight to choose a bride from this household. I have made my decision." Edmund straightened, already reaching for Victoria's hand to present her once more. Margaret's smile returned, triumphant and glowing. "I will take the rejected one," the Duke said. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then chaos erupted in whispers, gasps, and half-formed questions that no one dared ask aloud. Margaret's face drained of color. Victoria's mouth fell open in stunned disbelief, her carefully constructed composure shattering in an instant. Edmund looked as though he had been struck. "Your Grace," Edmund stammered. "There must be some confusion. Nora is not. She was never presented as a candidate. She has no dowry, no training, no—" "I did not ask for her dowry," the Duke said, cutting him off without raising his voice. "I asked for her hand. I am told she has been rejected by this family in every way that matters. Overlooked, dismissed, treated as unworthy of notice. I find that curious, given what I have observed." "Observed?" Margaret's voice came out sharp and brittle. "Your Grace, with respect, you have only just arrived. You cannot possibly know anything about her." The Duke's gaze flicked toward Margaret, and something in his expression made her step back half a pace. "I know more than you think," he said quietly, "and I have made my choice. Nora Ellison will become my wife." Nora's ears were ringing. This could not be real. She searched the Duke's face for any sign of mockery, any hint that this was an elaborate joke designed to humiliate her before the entire nobility of the capital. But she found nothing, except that same unreadable calm. "Your Grace," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think you have made an error. I am no one. I have nothing to offer a man of your position." "That is not for you to decide," he said. "It is for me." Victoria finally found her voice, and it came out as a furious hiss. "This is absurd. I have spent years preparing for a match like this. I have studied, trained, sacrificed everything to become worthy of a noble house, and you would choose her instead? A girl who cannot even afford a proper gown?" "I am not interested in gowns," the Duke said, without so much as glancing at her. "I am interested in character, and I have seen enough of this household tonight to understand exactly where that lies." The insult landed with surgical precision, and Victoria's face flushed a deep, humiliated red. Margaret grabbed her daughter's arm, perhaps to stop her from saying something even more damaging in front of the assembled guests. But the damage had already been done. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire, and Nora could hear fragments of them drifting past her ears. The rejected one, the forgotten daughter. How strange, how shocking, how delicious a scandal for tomorrow's gossip. Edmund attempted one final plea, his voice low and urgent, as he leaned toward the Duke. "Your Grace, please reconsider. Nora is unaccustomed to society. She would embarrass your house. Surely you would prefer a bride who understands how to carry your name with dignity." "I have made my decision," the Duke repeated, and there was something final and immovable in his tone, like a door closing and locking. "Nora Ellison will leave with me tonight." "Tonight?" Nora's voice cracked on the word. She had not expected to leave the only home she had ever known. Within the same hour she learned her fate had changed forever. "Your Grace, I have nothing packed, no belongings prepared, no. You will want for nothing in my household," he said. "That is a promise, not a courtesy." She searched his face one more time, desperate to find some explanation for why a man she had never met, a man known throughout the kingdom for his coldness and his silence, would choose her over the daughter groomed for exactly this moment. But his expression gave nothing away. Whatever reason lay behind his choice, he intended to keep it locked inside himself for now. Margaret's composure finally cracked entirely. "This is an insult," she snapped, forgetting herself in front of the crowd. "You cannot simply walk into our home and steal away a servant girl while humiliating my daughter in front of all of society." The Duke turned to face her fully for the first time, and something in his gaze made even the proud Margaret Ellison fall silent. "I have not stolen anything," he said. "I have chosen, and I suggest you remember, madam, that I am not a man accustomed to having my choices questioned twice." The threat, though quiet, was unmistakable. Margaret's mouth snapped shut, and she said nothing further, though the fury in her eyes promised this was far from over. The Duke extended his hand toward Nora. It was a simple gesture, but it felt enormous, as though the entire future rested inside it. Nora looked down at her own hands, chapped from years of washing linens and scrubbing floors, and hesitated. "I do not understand why you are doing this," she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. "You do not need to understand it tonight," he replied, his voice softening by the smallest degree, barely perceptible, but she caught it. "You only need to trust that I would not make this choice lightly." Behind her, she could hear Victoria's furious breathing, could feel Edmund's stunned silence, could sense Margaret already calculating how to undo the damage of this night. But in front of her stood a man offering her a hand, a future, and an escape from the only life she had ever known, one built entirely on rejection and neglect. Slowly, with her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it, Nora placed her hand in his. The moment their palms touched, a strange stillness settled over her, as if the chaos of the ballroom had faded into the background. His grip was firm but careful, as though he understood exactly how fragile trust could be, and had no intention of breaking it carelessly. "Your new life begins tonight." As they walked together toward the doors of Ellison Hall, past rows of stunned guests and flickering candlelight, Nora dared to glance over her shoulder one final time. Victoria stood frozen in her golden gown, her dreams of nobility crumbling before her eyes. Margaret's face had twisted into something sharp and calculating, already plotting her next move. Edmund simply stared, unable to comprehend how the daughter he had dismissed for years had somehow become the most important person in the room. Nora turned back toward the doors, toward the cold night air waiting beyond them, toward a future she could not yet imagine. Whatever waited for her in the Duke's household, whatever secrets lay behind his unreadable eyes, one truth had already become clear. The girl who had spent her whole life being rejected had just become the woman a Duke refused to let go. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones, and Nora sat pressed against the window, watching the lights of Ellison Hall shrink into the darkness behind her. Her hands trembled in her lap, not from the cold, but from the sheer disbelief of everything that had happened in the last hour. She had gone to that ballroom as a girl no one wanted, and she had left it as the future Duchess of Blackwood. Across from her, the Duke sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the passing countryside outside the window, his face as unreadable as it had been inside the ballroom. He had not spoken a single word since they left, and the silence between them stretched so long that Nora began to wonder if she had imagined the warmth she thought she'd heard in his voice earlier. "Your Grace," she finally said, unable to bear the quiet any longer. "May I ask where we are going?" "Blackwood Manor," he answered without looking at her. "It will be your home now. And what will be expected of me there?" He turned his head slightly, studying her with that same intense, unreadable gaze. "For now, nothing more than to rest. You have had a difficult night." Nora almost laughed at the understatement, though nothing about her situation felt remotely funny. She had been plucked from a life of scrubbing floors and mending old dresses, and thrust into a world of dukes and manors, without a single moment to prepare herself. Difficult barely began to describe it. They rode the rest of the way without speaking, and Nora spent the time trying to piece together fragments of her past that might explain why this cold, powerful man had chosen her. She had never met him before tonight. She had never even attended a social event grand enough to cross paths with someone of his rank. Whatever his reasons, they remained locked behind that impenetrable expression. When the carriage finally slowed, Nora peered out the window and felt her breath catch in her throat. Blackwood Manor rose against the night sky like something out of an old legend, its towers dark against the stars, its windows glowing with warm candlelight. It was larger than anything she had ever seen, larger even than the grandest homes she had glimpsed from a distance in the capital. A row of servants stood waiting at the entrance, lanterns held aloft, their faces carefully neutral as the carriage door opened. The Duke stepped out first, then turned and offered his hand to help Nora down, a small gesture of courtesy that surprised her given his cold demeanor. "This is Nora Ellison, the Duke announced to the assembled staff, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "She will soon be my wife. You will treat her with the same respect you show me." A murmur of acknowledgement passed through the servants, though Nora caught more than a few curious glances directed her way. She understood their confusion. She looked nothing like the noblewomen who usually arrived at grand manors as brides. Her dress was worn, her hands rough, her posture shaped by years of servitude rather than aristocratic training. An older woman stepped forward from the group, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, her expression kind, despite the formality of her bearing. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor, my lady," she said, offering a warm smile that felt like the first genuine kindness Nora had received all evening. "I am Helena, the head housekeeper. If there is anything you need, you have only to ask." "Thank you," Nora said softly, grateful for even this small warmth in the middle of such an overwhelming night. The Duke gave a few quiet instructions to his staff before turning back to Nora. "Helena will show you to your rooms. Rest tonight. We will speak more tomorrow." "Your Grace," Nora said, stopping him before he could walk away. "I still do not understand why you chose me. I would like to know." For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked almost like hesitation, though it vanished so quickly, she could not be certain she had seen it at all. "Not tonight," he said finally. "There will be time for answers later. Tonight, you should simply rest." He turned and walked toward the manor without another word, leaving Nora standing in the courtyard with more questions than she had arrived with. Helena gently touched her arm, guiding her toward the entrance with the same patient kindness she had shown moments before. "Come along, my lady," Helena said. "You must be exhausted." The inside of Blackwood Manor was even grander than Nora had imagined. High ceilings stretched overhead, decorated with intricate molding. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the hallways, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. Everything smelled faintly of polished wood and burning candles, a scent entirely different from the damp, musty air of Ellison Hall's servant quarters. Helena led her up a wide staircase and down a long corridor, before stopping at a set of double doors. She pushed them open to reveal a bedroom larger than the entire servants' wing Nora had lived in for most of her life. A large four-poster bed dominated the room, draped in soft blue fabric. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across polished furniture and thick woven rugs. "This is yours now," Helena said, watching Nora's stunned expression with obvious sympathy. "I know it must feel overwhelming." "I do not understand any of this," Nora admitted quietly, running her fingers over the soft blanket at the foot of the bed. "Why would the Duke choose me? I have nothing to offer him. No dowry, no training, no connections." Helena's expression softened further, and she hesitated before speaking, as though weighing how much she was permitted to share. "The Duke does not make decisions lightly," she said carefully. "Whatever his reasons, I have never known him to act without purpose." "But you do not know the reason either," Nora pressed gently. "No," Helena admitted. "That, my lady, is something only he can tell you, and knowing him, he will tell you exactly when he believes the time is right, not a moment before." Nora sighed, sinking onto the edge of the bed, suddenly aware of how utterly exhausted she felt. The events of the evening replayed in her mind over and over. The shocked faces of her family, the fury in Victoria's eyes, the strange calm certainty in the Duke's voice as he claimed her in front of the entire nobility. "Try to rest," Helena said gently, moving toward the door. "Tomorrow will bring more clarity, I am sure of it." After Helena left, Nora remained sitting on the edge of the bed for a long while, staring into the flickering fire. Despite the luxury surrounding her, despite the promise of a future far removed from the misery of her old life, a knot of anxiety refused to loosen in her chest. She had spent her entire life being told she was worthless, unwanted, a burden tolerated only out of obligation. Now, suddenly, a powerful Duke had declared her worthy of his hand in front of the highest members of society, and she had no idea why. She thought of Victoria's stunned, furious expression, and a chill ran through her. Victoria was not the kind of person who accepted humiliation quietly. Whatever scheme she and her mother concocted to reclaim their pride, Nora suspected it would not be long before its effects reached Blackwood Manor. She thought, too, of the Duke himself, of his unreadable eyes and quiet, careful words. There was something beneath his cold exterior, something he kept locked away, as tightly as his reasons for choosing her. She found herself wondering what kind of man he truly was, beneath the icy reputation the entire kingdom seemed to fear. Eventually, exhaustion won out over her racing thoughts, and Nora changed into the simple nightgown left for her, climbing into the enormous, unfamiliar bed. The mattress was softer than anything she had ever slept on, and despite everything, despite the uncertainty and fear tangled together in her chest, sleep pulled her under almost immediately. She woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through tall windows and the soft sound of birds outside. For a moment, she forgot where she was, and the disorientation of waking in a strange, luxurious room sent a spike of panic through her chest. Then, the memories of the previous night came rushing back, and she sat up slowly, taking in her new surroundings in the clear light of day. A soft knock sounded at the door before Helena entered, carrying a tray of breakfast and a gentle smile. "Good morning, my lady. I hope you slept well." "I did, thank you," Nora said, though her mind still buzzed with unanswered questions. "The Duke has asked that you join him in the study once you have eaten and dressed," Helena said, setting the tray down on a small table near the window. "He said he owes you an explanation." Nora's stomach tightened with a mixture of anticipation and nerves. Finally, she would learn the truth behind his strange, sudden decision. She ate quickly, barely tasting the food, her mind racing through every possible reason a cold, powerful Duke might have for choosing the most overlooked girl in an entire household. After dressing in a simple gown Helena provided, one far finer than anything Nora had ever owned, she made her way through the unfamiliar corridors of Blackwood Manor, following Helena's earlier directions toward the study. Her heart pounded with every step, and by the time she reached the heavy wooden door, her hands were trembling. She knocked softly, and the Duke's voice answered from within. "Enter." Nora pushed open the door and stepped inside, finding him seated behind a large desk covered in papers and ledgers, his expression as composed and unreadable as ever. He looked up as she entered, and for a brief moment, something shifted in his gaze, something that almost looked like relief. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Nora sat carefully, folding her hands in her lap, waiting for the explanation she had been promised the night before. The Duke studied her for a long moment before finally speaking, and when he did, his words carried a weight that told her this conversation would change everything she thought she understood about her sudden, dramatic change in fortune. "Before I tell you why I chose you," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something about my own past first. It will help explain everything that follows." Nora leaned forward slightly, her curiosity overtaking her nervousness. "I am listening, Your Grace." The Duke rose from his chair and walked toward the window, his back to her as he gathered his thoughts. 10 years ago, before I inherited my title, I was sent to observe the province where your family resides. My father wished to understand how the local nobility treated those beneath them, particularly the servants and dependents within their own households. I traveled in plain clothing, unrecognized, and stayed in the town near Ellison Hall for several months. Nora's brow furrowed. "I do not recall ever meeting you before last night." "You would not remember," he said, turning back to face her. "You were young, perhaps 12 years old at the time, and I made certain never to draw attention to myself. But I remember you. I remember watching you carry water buckets larger than yourself across the courtyard while your stepsister sat idle, watching you work without lifting a finger to help. I remember the winter storm, when a child from the town fell through the ice on the frozen pond, and while grown men hesitated, afraid of the danger, you ran without a second thought and pulled him to safety, ruining your only good pair of shoes in the process." Nora's breath caught. She remembered that day vividly, though she had never known anyone of importance had witnessed it. "That was so long ago," she whispered. "I never thought anyone noticed." "I noticed," the Duke said quietly, "and I never forgot it. Over the years, I heard occasional reports about your family, about how you continued to be treated as little more than a servant, despite sharing their blood through your father. I heard of the sacrifices you made silently, the burdens you carried without complaint, the countless small acts of kindness you performed even for people who never bothered to thank you." "How could you possibly know all of that?" Nora asked, stunned. "I kept a quiet correspondence with certain trusted contacts in the region," he admitted. "I told myself it was simply due diligence, monitoring the province my father once asked me to observe. But the truth is, I never stopped wondering about the girl who risked her life for a stranger, without a moment's hesitation. Nora sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the weight of his words. All these years, while she believed herself invisible, unworthy of notice, a powerful nobleman had been quietly watching her story unfold from a distance, remembering her long after she assumed the world had forgotten she existed. When my father passed, and the title fell to me, the Duke continued, I inherited not only his lands, but his expectations. Society demanded that I marry, that I secure an heir, that I choose a bride worthy of carrying the Blackwood name. I attended countless balls, met dozens of eligible young women, all trained from birth to charm and impress. None of them held my attention for longer than a few minutes. And yet you chose me, Nora said softly, a girl you observed as a child and never spoke to. I chose you, he confirmed, because character built quietly, without witnesses or reward, is the only character I have ever trusted. Every woman I met in society smiled beautifully, because she had been trained to. You showed kindness and courage when you believed no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain from it. That is a rarer quality than beauty or wealth, and far more valuable to me. Nora felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. For years, she had believed her sacrifices went unnoticed, that her worth in the world amounted to nothing more than what use she provided to others. To learn that someone had witnessed her struggles and found value in them, rather than pity or dismissal, cracked something open inside her chest that she had kept tightly sealed for a very long time. I still do not understand why you waited until now, she said. Why choose this moment, this ceremony, to reveal all of this? The Duke's expression grew slightly more guarded. Because I learned recently that your family intended to force you into an arrangement far less favorable than the one I could offer. A merchant, older and unkind, had already approached your stepfather with an offer for your hand, seeking cheap labor disguised as marriage. I could not allow that to happen to you. Nora's stomach turned at the revelation. She had heard whispers of such an arrangement forming in recent weeks, but had assumed it concerned household matters, never imagining it involved her own future being bartered away without her knowledge or consent. They never told me, she said quietly, anger flickering beneath her shock. I suspected as much, the Duke said, which is why I acted when I did, publicly and decisively, leaving your family no opportunity to negotiate or interfere. I understand it must have felt sudden and overwhelming for you, and for that, I am sorry. But I could not risk losing the chance to protect you. Nora studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of deception, but found only quiet sincerity. The cold, unreadable Duke that all of society feared had, in his own careful and guarded way, been protecting her from the shadows for years, without ever asking for recognition or reward. Thank you, she finally said, her voice thick with emotion, for remembering me, for protecting me, even before I knew you existed. You do not need to thank me, he said, though something in his rigid posture softened slightly at her words. I only ask that you give yourself time to settle into this new life. I do not expect you to trust me immediately, nor to feel comfortable in surroundings so different from what you have known. But I promise you, within these walls, you will never again be treated as unworthy of notice. Nora nodded, though the weight of everything she had learned still pressed heavily on her chest. She thought of Victoria's furious expression the night before, of Margaret's barely concealed rage, of Edmund's stunned disbelief. Whatever peace she found within Blackwood Manor, she suspected her family would not simply accept this outcome quietly. My family will not let this rest, she said aloud, voicing the fear that had been building since the carriage ride the previous night. Victoria has spent years preparing for a match like this. She will not forgive being passed over so publicly. The Duke's expression hardened slightly. Let them plot however they wish. I have dealt with far more dangerous schemes than the wounded pride of a spoiled young woman and her ambitious mother. You need only focus on adjusting to your new life. I will handle whatever challenges arise from your former family. You seem very confident, Nora observed, a small, cautious smile tugging at the corner of her mouth for the first time since arriving at the manor. I have learned, over the years, that confidence built on careful observation rarely fails me, he replied, and for just a moment, something that might have been the ghost of a smile flickered across his own usually stern face. The conversation shifted after that, moving into more practical matters. The Duke explained the basic structure of daily life within Blackwood Manor, introduced her, through description, to the various staff members she would come to know, and outlined the education she would receive in the coming weeks to prepare her for her eventual role as Duchess. "You will not be expected to master everything immediately," he assured her. "Helena will guide you patiently, and I have arranged for a tutor to assist with matters of etiquette and history relevant to noble society. There is no rush. We have time." Nora appreciated the reassurance, though the prospect of learning an entirely new way of life still felt daunting. She had spent years learning how to survive within the confines of servitude, how to anticipate the needs of others while suppressing her own, how to remain invisible enough to avoid punishment, but present enough to remain useful. Learning to exist as a duchess, expected to command respect rather than avoid notice, felt like learning an entirely foreign language. "May I ask you something else?" Nora said, as their conversation began drawing to a natural close. "Of course. Why did you never approach me directly over the years? If you had been watching my situation for so long, why wait until now, until this public, dramatic announcement, rather than simply reaching out quietly?" The Duke considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I did not wish to interfere in your life before I had the standing and authority to properly protect you from the consequences of that interference. As a young man without my title, any attempt to intervene on your behalf would have accomplished nothing, except placing you in greater danger from a family already inclined to resent you. I needed the power my position now affords me, before I could act without risking your safety further." Nora considered this explanation, and slowly, the pieces of his careful, calculated behavior began falling into place. Every choice he had made, from his years of silent observation to his sudden, dramatic public claim the night before, had been carefully designed to protect her, while minimizing the risk of her family's retaliation. "You have thought about this for a very long time," she said quietly. "Longer than you know," he admitted, and something in his voice carried a weight that suggested there remained more to his story than he had shared. Secrets perhaps too painful or complicated to reveal so soon after their first true conversation. As their meeting concluded and Nora rose to leave the study, she found herself viewing the cold, distant Duke in an entirely different light than she had the night before. Beneath his rigid composure and unreadable expressions lay a man who had quietly protected a forgotten girl for years, waiting patiently for the moment he could finally offer her the life she deserved. Whatever challenges awaited them, whatever schemes her furious family might concoct in retaliation, Nora walked out of that study feeling, for the first time in her life, that someone truly saw her value. A letter arrived at Blackwood Manor exactly 1 week after Nora's arrival, and the moment Helena placed it in her hands, Nora recognized the elegant, sharp handwriting on the envelope. It belonged to Margaret. Her fingers hesitated over the wax seal, a strange mixture of dread and curiosity twisting in her stomach, as she wondered what her stepmother could possibly want to say to her now. She broke the seal in the privacy of her room and unfolded the letter slowly. The words inside were dressed in polite, formal language, but the venom beneath them was impossible to miss. Margaret wrote of Victoria's supposed heartbreak, of the family's damaged reputation, of the debts and obligations that had piled up in the wake of Nora's sudden departure. She demanded that Nora use her new influence to secure a generous settlement for the family, framing it as nothing less than her duty as a daughter, however distant that relationship had become. Nora read the letter twice, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and old, familiar guilt. Even now, even after everything, some small part of her still felt obligated to please a family that had never once shown her genuine affection. She folded the letter carefully and decided she would need to speak with the Duke about it before responding. She found him later that afternoon in the Manor's private library, a room she had quickly come to love for its towering shelves and the quiet comfort of countless books she had never before had the luxury of reading. He looked up as she entered, setting aside the document he had been reviewing. "You look troubled," he observed, studying her expression with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "I received a letter from my stepmother," Nora admitted, handing it to him without hesitation. She had decided, in the days since their first true conversation, that honesty would serve their strange new partnership far better than the secrecy she had learned to rely on during her years at Ellison Hall. The Duke read through the letter quickly, his expression darkening slightly with each line. When he finished, he set it down on the table between them, with deliberate calm. "They waste no time," he said dryly. "I do not know how to respond," Nora admitted. "Part of me feels I owe them something, despite everything. But another part of me knows that giving in now would only invite more demands later." "The second part of you is correct," the Duke said firmly. "You owe your former family nothing, Nora. They treated you as a burden for years, denied you basic kindness, and even now, faced with the consequences of their own cruelty, they seek only to extract further value from you, rather than reflect on their behavior." Nora nodded slowly, though the old habits of guilt and obligation did not disappear so easily, even with logic firmly on her side. "What would you suggest I do?" "Nothing," the Duke said simply. "You owe them no response at all. Silence will frustrate them far more than any refusal you could write, and it denies them the satisfaction of provoking a reaction from you." Nora considered his advice, and slowly, a small measure of relief settled over her. For years, she had been trained to respond immediately to every demand placed upon her, terrified of the consequences that followed disobedience. The idea that she could simply choose silence, that she held enough power now to ignore their manipulations entirely, felt strange and unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for helping me see this clearly." "You would have arrived at the same conclusion eventually," he replied. "You simply needed a moment to separate old habits from present reality." Over the following weeks, Nora settled gradually into the rhythms of life at Blackwood Manor. Helena proved a patient and kind guide, teaching her the intricate customs of noble etiquette, without ever making her feel foolish for not already knowing them. A tutor named Mr. Wexford arrived twice weekly to instruct her in history, literature, and the political landscape of the kingdom's noble houses, subjects she absorbed eagerly, hungry for the education she had been denied throughout her childhood. She discovered, too, a genuine talent for managing household accounts, a skill she had developed unintentionally over years of stretching meager resources at Ellison Hall to cover far more than they should have allowed. When she mentioned this history casually to the Duke one evening over dinner, his eyebrows rose with obvious interest. "You manage the household finances at Ellison Hall?" he asked. "Unofficially," Nora admitted. "Margaret preferred to spend rather than budget, and someone needed to ensure the servants were paid and the household did not fall into ruin. I took over the ledgers quietly when I was perhaps 15, though no one ever formally acknowledged it." "Show me," the Duke said, and the following day, he presented her with the household ledgers of Blackwood Manor itself, watching with quiet fascination as she reviewed the numbers with a sharp, practiced eye, identifying inefficiencies and suggesting adjustments that his previous steward had overlooked for years. "This is remarkable," he said, studying her notes afterward. "You have a genuine talent for this." Nora felt a warmth spread through her chest at his praise, unfamiliar and pleasant. She had spent years performing tasks that went entirely unnoticed and unappreciated, and the simple experience of being recognized for her abilities felt like discovering a part of herself she had never been allowed to explore. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, small moments of warmth began appearing between Nora and the Duke, cracks in the icy composure that all of society believed defined him entirely. He began seeking her opinion on household matters, valuing her perspective in a way no one ever had before. During quiet evenings in the library, he occasionally shared fragments of his own history, stories of his father's strict expectations, of the loneliness that came with inheriting a title far too young. One evening, as autumn rain tapped gently against the library windows, Nora found herself studying him across the small table where they sat reviewing correspondence together. "May I ask you something personal?" she said. He glanced up, setting aside his papers. "Of course. Why does everyone call you the Iron Duke? Why does all of society believe you incapable of warmth?" He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because I learned early that warmth, when shown carelessly, becomes a weakness others exploit. My father taught me that lesson through harsh experience. I built walls to protect myself, and over time, those walls became easier to maintain than the alternative." "But you are not truly cold," Nora said softly. "I have seen glimpses of something else beneath that composure." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of vulnerability, quickly suppressed but not entirely hidden. "Perhaps," he admitted quietly. There are certain people around whom those walls feel less necessary. The words hung between them, charged with meaning. Neither of them seemed ready to fully acknowledge. Nora felt her cheeks warm and looked away first, though the moment lingered in her memory long after their conversation moved to safer topics. Despite these small, growing moments of connection, unease continued to simmer beneath the surface of Nora's new life. Reports occasionally reached Blackwood Manor of Victoria's activities in the capital, whispers of her attending social events with renewed determination, positioning herself deliberately in circles connected to the Duke's associates and rivals. Margaret, too, had not remained idle, and Helena mentioned overhearing rumors among the staff of visitors from Ellison Hall, attempting to gather information about the manor's daily routines. Nora tried to push these concerns aside, focusing instead on the genuine progress she felt within herself, the growing confidence, the budding warmth developing between herself and the Duke despite his cautious, guarded nature. But a persistent instinct, honed through years of navigating a household built on hidden resentments, warned her that her family's silence following Margaret's rejected letter did not signal surrender. It signaled patience. And patience, in Margaret's hands, had always proven far more dangerous than open confrontation. One afternoon, while walking through the manor's expansive gardens with Helena, Nora noticed a carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest pausing briefly at the edge of the property, before continuing down the road without stopping. The sight sent a small chill through her, though she could not explain exactly why. "Do you recognize that crest?" she asked Helena, pointing toward the retreating carriage. Helena squinted toward the road, her expression thoughtful. "I believe that belongs to Lord Gerald Finch, my lady. A minor nobleman known for his ambitions, rather than his character. I do not believe he has any particular business with Blackwood Manor." Nora filed the name away carefully, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach that she could not quite shake. Whatever business brought Lord Finch so close to the Duke's estate without stopping, she suspected it would not remain a mystery for long. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Nora found herself staring out her window toward the darkened road beyond the manor's gates, wondering what schemes her family might already be setting into motion, and whether the fragile peace she had begun building within these walls would survive whatever storm approached. The invitation arrived on a crisp morning, delivered by a liveried messenger who bowed low before presenting the sealed envelope to Helena. It bore the crest of the royal court itself, an announcement of the autumn gathering held annually at the palace, an event attended by every noble family of significance throughout the kingdom. Nora's stomach dropped the moment Helena explained its importance. "This will be your first appearance in society as the Duke's intended," Helena said, her tone carefully measured. "Every noble family will be watching closely, my lady, including, I imagine, your former family." Nora felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. She had made progress in the weeks since arriving at Blackwood Manor, learning etiquette, history, and household management with growing confidence. But the idea of facing Victoria and Margaret in a public setting, surrounded by the very people who had witnessed her humiliation and sudden rise, filled her with dread. She raised the matter with the Duke that evening, finding him in his study reviewing correspondence related to his estate's holdings. "I received notice of the palace gathering," she said, watching his expression carefully. "I expected as much," he replied without looking up immediately. "It occurs every autumn, and given our recent engagement, our attendance will be expected without exception." "Victoria will be there," Nora said quietly, "and Margaret." The Duke finally looked up, setting his papers aside entirely. "I imagine so. Does this concern you?" "Of course it concerns me," Nora admitted, some of her old insecurity creeping back into her voice, despite her best efforts to suppress it. "I have spent my entire life being dismissed and humiliated by that family. Facing them now, in front of the entire nobility, feels like walking directly into danger." The Duke rose from his desk and crossed the room to stand before her, his expression softening into something gentler than his usual composed demeanor. "You are no longer the girl hiding behind pillars at Ellison Hall," he said firmly. "You are the future Duchess of Blackwood, educated, capable, and far more resilient than you give yourself credit for. Whatever schemes Victoria or Margaret bring to that gathering, you will face them from a position of strength they cannot match." Nora appreciated his confidence, though a lingering unease remained. She had learned, through painful experience, that Margaret rarely acted without careful calculation, and the timing of this gathering, so soon after their public rejection, seemed unlikely to be coincidental. Meanwhile, In a quiet parlor within Ellison Hall, Margaret sat across from Victoria and a visiting guest, whose presence had not been announced to the wider household. Lord Gerald Finch leaned forward in his chair, his expression calculating as he addressed the two women before him. "The Duke's reputation for coldness works entirely in our favor," Gerald said smoothly. "No one in society expects genuine warmth from him. If we can plant sufficient doubt about the girl's character before the gathering, suggesting perhaps that she manipulated her way into his favor through deception rather than genuine merit, the resulting scandal could unravel this engagement entirely." "And what do you gain from assisting us, Lord Finch?" Margaret asked, her sharp eyes studying him with open suspicion. Gerald smiled thinly. "I have my own ambitions regarding the Duke's holdings and influence. Should this engagement collapse, and should Victoria find herself once again eligible for a match of appropriate standing, I believe our families could benefit considerably from closer association." Victoria, who had remained silent through most of the conversation, finally spoke, her voice sharp with barely contained fury. "I want more than mere scandal, Lord Finch. I want that girl utterly humiliated in front of everyone who witnessed my rejection. I want her exposed as the fraud she truly is." "Patience, my dear," Gerald said smoothly. "We will construct a narrative so convincing that the Duke himself will begin to doubt his own choice. A few carefully placed rumors, a fabricated history of manipulation, and by the time the gathering concludes, society will view her not as a woman of hidden virtue, but as a calculating opportunist who deceived a powerful man into an unsuitable match." Margaret nodded slowly, satisfaction creeping into her expression. "What exactly do you propose?" Gerald outlined his plan carefully, detailing false testimonies from supposed acquaintances of Nora's, fabricated stories suggesting she had previously attempted to seduce wealthy suitors through manipulation and deceit, and forged correspondence designed to suggest she had schemed for months to secure the Duke's attention rather than being chosen through genuine character. The plan was elaborate, cruel, and disturbingly well constructed, clearly the product of considerable time and effort. "This will destroy her completely," Victoria said, a satisfied smile finally spreading across her face, for the first time since the humiliating night at Ellison Hall. "Precisely," Gerald agreed, "and once her reputation lies in ruins, the Duke will have little choice but to distance himself from the scandal, regardless of his personal feelings. No man of his standing can afford to remain publicly attached to a woman society believes capable of such deception." As their conversation continued late into the evening, the three conspirators refined their plan with growing enthusiasm, unaware that one of Helena's trusted contacts within the capital had already overheard fragments of their scheme, through a servant loyal to Blackwood Manor rather than Ellison Hall. 2 days later, Helena approached Nora with visible urgency, closing the study door carefully behind her before speaking. "My lady, I have received troubling information from a contact within the capital. Your stepmother, along with Victoria and a nobleman named Lord Gerald Finch, are constructing false accusations against your character, intended to be revealed publicly during the palace gathering." Nora's blood ran cold. "What kind of accusations?" "Claims that you deliberately manipulated the Duke through deceit, fabricated testimonies suggesting a history of scheming against wealthy suitors, forged documents designed to paint you as a calculating opportunist rather than the woman he genuinely came to respect." Nora felt her hands begin to tremble, old fears resurfacing with painful familiarity. Throughout her childhood, she had learned that no matter how carefully she behaved, no matter how much kindness or diligence she demonstrated, Margaret and Victoria always found ways to twist reality against her favor. The idea of facing such fabricated accusations in front of the entire nobility, without any opportunity to prepare a defense, terrified her. "We must tell the Duke immediately," Nora said, already rising from her chair. She found him in his private study and relayed Helena's information with as much composure as she could manage, though her voice trembled slightly by the time she finished explaining the scheme in full detail. To her surprise, rather than alarm, the Duke's expression settled into something calm and calculating, almost predatory in its focus. "They have made a significant error," he said quietly, once she finished speaking. "What do you mean?" Nora asked, confused by his apparent lack of concern. "Schemes built on fabrication require secrecy to succeed," he explained. The moment we possess advanced knowledge of their plans, we hold the advantage. Rather than reacting defensively during the gathering itself, we can prepare thoroughly, gathering evidence to expose their deception before it ever gains traction among society. How do you propose we do that? Nora asked, cautious hope beginning to replace her earlier fear. Leave that to me, the Duke said, his tone carrying the same quiet confidence that had first convinced Nora, weeks ago, that this man possessed depths far beyond his cold public reputation. I have connections within the capital, more than capable of investigating Lord Finch's true motives and uncovering the falsehood behind whatever testimonies they intend to present. Meanwhile, you will continue your preparations for the gathering, and I will ensure that when the moment comes for them to reveal their scheme, it will be their own reputations that suffer the consequences, not yours. Nora studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of doubt, but found only steady, unwavering resolve. Whatever fear had gripped her upon learning of her family's plot began to settle into something steadier, a growing trust that this man, despite his cold reputation and guarded nature, intended to protect her fiercely against whatever cruelty her family attempted to unleash. Thank you, she said quietly, for believing me without question. I have known your character far longer than you realize, he reminded her gently. Nothing your family invents will convince me otherwise. Over the following days, Blackwood Manor buzzed with quiet, careful activity as the Duke's trusted associates began investigating Lord Finch's background, uncovering financial troubles and previous scandals he had successfully concealed from public knowledge. Meanwhile, Helena worked to identify the supposed witnesses Margaret intended to present, tracing their connections back to servants and minor acquaintances, easily bribed or coerced into providing false testimony. Nora, for her part, spent her days continuing her lessons with renewed determination, refusing to allow fear of her family's scheme to undermine the progress she had made. She practiced her etiquette with Helena, reviewed household accounts with growing confidence, and spent quiet evenings with the Duke discussing strategy, her fear slowly transforming into a fierce determination to face whatever confrontation awaited her at the palace gathering. As the day of the event drew closer, Nora realized that whatever else happened, she was no longer the frightened girl who had once hidden behind pillars, terrified of her family's cruelty. She had become someone capable of standing beside a Duke, prepared to face deception and scandal, with evidence, courage, and an unshakable ally at her side. 3 nights before the palace gathering, a fierce storm rolled across the countryside, rattling the windows of Blackwood Manor with violent gusts of wind and rain. Nora found herself unable to sleep, her mind circling endlessly through imagined scenarios of the confrontation awaiting her, and she eventually gave up trying to rest, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and making her way down to the library, where a single candle still flickered beneath the door. She pushed it open quietly and found the Duke seated near the fireplace, a glass of untouched wine on the table beside him, staring into the flames with an expression far more troubled than his usual composed demeanor. I did not expect to find you awake, she said softly, hesitating in the doorway. He looked up, and for a moment, something raw and unguarded flickered across his face before he could compose himself. Nor I you, he replied. Please, come in. The storm makes sleep difficult for me as well, though for reasons that have little to do with tonight's weather. Nora settled into the chair across from him, drawn by the unusual vulnerability in his voice. Would you like to talk about it? He was quiet for a long moment, and Nora wondered if she had overstepped some invisible boundary. But eventually he spoke, his voice low and measured, as though each word required careful consideration before being released. My mother died during a storm very similar to this one, when I was 8 years old. She had gone into early labor with what would have been my younger sister, and the physicians could not reach the manor in time due to flooded roads. I am so sorry, Nora said quietly, her heart aching for the grief she heard buried beneath his controlled tone. My father never fully recovered from her loss, he continued. He became distant, cold, consumed entirely by his responsibilities, and increasingly incapable of showing warmth toward anyone, including his own son. He believed emotion made a man weak, vulnerable to manipulation and disappointment. He raised me according to that belief, teaching me to suppress every feeling that might be used against me. Nora began to understand, with growing clarity, the origins of the icy reputation that had followed this man throughout his adult life. He had not been born cold. He had been shaped into coldness by grief, and a father too broken to offer any alternative. "Is that why society calls you the Iron Duke?" she asked gently. "Partly," he admitted, "though there is more to the story than my father's teachings alone." He paused, staring into the fire for a long moment before continuing. "When I was 20, before I inherited my title, I fell in love with a young woman from a respected but modest family. I believed, for the first time since my mother's passing, that warmth and connection might be possible for me after all." Nora leaned forward slightly, sensing the weight of what was coming. "What happened?" "She was not truly interested in me," he said, his voice carefully flat, though Nora could sense the old pain still lingering beneath the surface. "She was interested in the title I would eventually inherit, the wealth and status that came attached to my family name. When she discovered that my father's declining health meant my inheritance might be delayed for years, potentially even complicated by legal disputes among distant relatives, she ended our engagement swiftly and married a wealthier suitor within months." "That is a cruel thing to endure," Nora said softly. "It confirmed everything my father had taught me," the Duke said. "That warmth invites exploitation. That vulnerability leaves a person open to being used and discarded once their usefulness expires. I built my walls higher after that experience, determined never again to allow anyone close enough to wound me so deeply." Nora studied him carefully, understanding now why he had approached their entire courtship with such careful, deliberate caution, rather than open affection. His coldness was not indifference. It was armor, built from years of loss and betrayal, protecting a heart that had already been wounded too deeply to trust easily again. "Is that why you chose me?" she asked quietly. "Because you believed I would never seek to use you the way she did?" "Partly," he admitted again, "though it is more accurate to say I chose you because your character, demonstrated repeatedly through years of quiet sacrifice, without any expectation of reward, convinced me that genuine kindness still existed somewhere in this world. I needed proof of that, Nora, more than I ever admitted to myself." Something shifted in Nora's chest, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. She had spent weeks wondering about the reasons behind his sudden dramatic choice, and now, finally, she understood the full depth of what had brought them together. Two people, each shaped by rejection and loss, finding in each other a reflection of resilience they had not expected to encounter. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said softly. "I know it could not have been easy to share. I find that certain people make honesty easier than I once believed possible," he replied, and this time, when their eyes met, neither of them looked away immediately. The storm continued to rage outside the windows, but within the quiet warmth of the library, something had shifted permanently between them. Nora found herself studying the sharp lines of his face, softened now by firelight and vulnerability, and realized with quiet certainty that whatever affection had begun growing between them over these past weeks had deepened into something far more significant than simple gratitude or convenience. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I have no interest in your title or your wealth. I have lived without either for my entire life, and I have survived. What I have come to value, in these weeks at Blackwood Manor, is simply you, the man beneath the reputation." His expression softened further, and for the first time since she had arrived at the manor, Nora watched something that might genuinely be called a smile touch his lips. "I believe you," he said quietly, "which, given my history, is no small admission." They sat together for a long while after that, talking quietly about smaller, gentler subjects, sharing fragments of childhood memories and half-forgotten dreams neither of them had voiced aloud in years. When Nora finally rose to return to her room, the storm outside had begun to quiet, and something within her had settled as well, a steadiness she had not felt since arriving at Blackwood Manor weeks earlier. The following 2 days passed in a blur of final preparations for the palace gathering. Helena's contacts confirmed the full extent of Margaret's scheme, providing detailed evidence of Lord Finch's financial desperation and the fabricated nature of the witnesses he intended to present. The Duke reviewed each piece of evidence carefully, constructing a counter-strategy designed not merely to defend Nora against the false accusations, but to expose the conspiracy publicly, ensuring her family would face far greater consequences than they had ever anticipated. On the morning of the gathering, Nora stood before a tall mirror in her chambers, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that Helena had commissioned specifically for the occasion, her hair arranged elegantly by a skilled attendant who had spent the entire morning perfecting every detail. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her, poised and confident, nothing like the frightened girl who had once hidden behind pillars at Ellison Hall. The Duke appeared in the doorway as she finished her preparations, dressed in formal attire befitting his station, his expression carrying its usual composed authority, though something warmer flickered in his eyes as he took in her appearance. "You look remarkable," he said simply. "I feel remarkably nervous," Nora admitted honestly. "That is understandable," he replied, crossing the room to stand beside her. "But remember, you are not facing this gathering alone. Whatever your family attempts tonight, we face it together, with truth and evidence firmly on our side." Nora nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. Whatever schemes Margaret, Victoria, and Lord Finch had spent weeks constructing, whatever humiliation they hoped to inflict upon her in front of the entire nobility, she intended to walk into that palace, not as the rejected girl they remembered, but as a woman fully prepared to defend her own worth, backed by a man who had chosen her not despite her past, but because of the character it had revealed. As they descended toward the waiting carriage, Nora took one final steadying breath, aware that the events of tonight would determine not only her own future, but the fate of every relationship she had ever known. The palace ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles reflected endlessly in gilded mirrors, and the moment Nora stepped through the grand entrance beside the Duke, every conversation in the room seemed to falter simultaneously. Eyes turned toward them from every direction, whispers rippling outward like waves disturbing a still pond. She kept her chin lifted, her hand resting lightly on the Duke's arm, refusing to let the weight of so many stares shake the composure she had worked so hard to build. Across the room, she spotted Victoria almost immediately, dressed in a striking crimson gown, clearly chosen to command attention. Margaret stood beside her daughter, and slightly behind them both, Lord Gerald Finch watched the entrance with calculating patience, like a predator waiting for the precise moment to strike. "They are watching for an opening," the Duke murmured quietly, leaning close enough that only Nora could hear him. "Do not give them one." They moved through the crowd, exchanging polite greetings with various noble families, many of whom seemed genuinely curious about the woman who had captured the notoriously cold Duke's attention so publicly. Nora found herself surprising, even herself, with the ease of her conversation, drawing on weeks of careful instruction from Helena and countless hours of study to navigate the complex social dynamics of the gathering with growing confidence. It was nearly an hour into the evening when Margaret finally made her move, approaching with Victoria at her side and an expression of practiced concern arranged carefully across her face. "Your Grace," she said, offering a deep curtsy toward the Duke, before turning her attention toward Nora. "Nora, dear, how wonderful to see you looking so transformed." "Margaret," Nora replied evenly, refusing to allow the barely concealed condescension in her stepmother's voice to provoke a visible reaction. "I trust you and Victoria are well." "We have managed," Margaret said, her smile tightening slightly, "though I confess, some of us have found the recent changes rather difficult to accept." Victoria said nothing directly, though her eyes carried a sharpness that promised the true confrontation had not yet arrived. Lord Gerald Finch approached at that moment, bowing formally toward the Duke before addressing the small gathering with practiced charm. "Your Grace, Lady Nora," he said smoothly, "I wonder if I might have a moment of your time. There have been certain rumors circulating recently that I believe deserve open discussion, particularly given how directly they concern Lady Nora's character." The Duke's expression remained perfectly composed, though Nora caught the subtle tension building in his posture beside her. "What rumors would those be, Lord Finch?" "Troubling accounts," Gerald continued, raising his voice slightly, ensuring nearby guests could overhear the exchange, suggesting that Lady Nora's sudden elevation was not entirely the product of chance encounter, but rather a carefully orchestrated scheme, designed over several months to secure your attention through calculated manipulation. A hush fell over the immediate area as more guests turned to listen, drawn by the escalating tension in Gerald's voice. Victoria's lips curled into a satisfied smile, clearly relishing the moment they had spent weeks preparing. "That is a serious accusation," the Duke replied, his voice carrying an edge of danger that made several nearby guests take an unconscious step backward. I trust you have evidence to support such a claim, given the gravity of what you suggest. Indeed I do, Gerald said confidently, gesturing toward a small group of individuals who had been waiting discreetly near the edge of the gathering. 3 people stepped forward, their expressions carefully arranged into somber sincerity. These individuals have come forward with first-hand accounts of Lady Nora's previous attempts to secure advantageous matches through deception, well before her arrival at Blackwood Manor. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Nora felt her heart pound violently in her chest, though she forced herself to remain outwardly calm, remembering the Duke's earlier reassurance that they held far greater advantages than her family realized. The Duke turned toward the 3 supposed witnesses with an expression of cold, precise attention. Please, share these accounts in detail. I am certain everyone present would benefit from hearing the full story. The first witness, a nervous man Nora did not recognize, began stammering through a rehearsed account of supposedly witnessing Nora attempting to seduce a wealthy merchant several years earlier through calculated flattery and false promises. As he spoke, Nora noticed his eyes flickering repeatedly toward Lord Finch, as if seeking silent confirmation that he was performing his role correctly. Before he could finish, the Duke raised a single hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "How curious," he said calmly, addressing the crowd rather than the witness directly. "This man claims to have witnessed events in a province he has never actually visited." Gasps rippled through the assembled guests. The witness's face drained of color as the Duke continued, his voice growing sharper with each carefully measured word. "I took the liberty, upon learning of these planned accusations several days ago, of investigating each supposed witness thoroughly," the Duke announced, loud enough now for the entire surrounding area to hear clearly. "This man has never set foot within 50 miles of Ellison Hall. His true occupation involves performing testimony for coin, a service he has provided on at least 4 previous occasions for individuals seeking to manipulate public opinion through fabricated accusations." The crowd's murmurs transformed into outright gasps of shock, and Margaret's confident expression finally began to crack. Victoria's satisfied smile faltered as she glanced nervously between her mother and Lord Finch, searching for reassurance that their plan remained intact. "This is preposterous," Gerald said quickly, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Your Grace, surely you do not mean to suggest—" "I mean to suggest exactly what the evidence demonstrates," the Duke interrupted coldly, producing a folded document from within his jacket and holding it aloft for the surrounding guests to see. "This letter, obtained through entirely legitimate means, details your own considerable debts, Lord Finch. Debts you have concealed from society through careful manipulation of your public image. It also outlines your explicit agreement with Margaret Ellison to fabricate testimony against Lady Nora in exchange for a future alliance with Victoria Ellison, contingent upon the successful destruction of this engagement." The ballroom fell into stunned, absolute silence. Every eye in the vicinity fixed upon Gerald and Margaret, watching their carefully constructed scheme collapse in real time before the very society they had hoped to manipulate. "Where did you obtain such a document?" Margaret demanded, her voice sharp with panic rather than her earlier calculated calm. "I have connections considerably more thorough than you anticipated," the Duke replied evenly. "I suggest, for your own sake, that you cease this charade immediately, before further evidence emerges that proves considerably more damaging to your family's already fragile reputation." Victoria's composure shattered entirely, her carefully maintained mask of confidence collapsing into visible panic. "Mother, what is he talking about? You told me this plan was foolproof." "Silence," Margaret hissed at her daughter, though the damage among the watching crowd had already been done thoroughly and irreversibly. Nora, who had remained quiet throughout the confrontation, finally stepped forward, addressing the crowd directly for the first time. "I understand this must be difficult to witness," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I spent years being told by this family that I was worthless, unwanted, a burden they tolerated only out of obligation. I never expected recognition or reward for the sacrifices I made during those years, but I also never expected them to fabricate such elaborate lies, simply because they could not accept losing control over my future." Her words carried clearly across the silent ballroom, and Nora felt something powerful settle within her chest as she spoke, a strength she had never before been permitted to express so openly. "I do not seek revenge against my family tonight," she continued. "I seek only the truth, spoken plainly. so that society understands exactly what occurred here. I did not manipulate anyone into choosing me. I simply lived my life honestly, and that honesty, it seems, proved more valuable than any scheme Lord Finch and my stepmother could construct." A murmur of approval rippled through the surrounding guests, and Nora watched with quiet satisfaction as several nearby noblewomen nodded approvingly at her composed, dignified response. Margaret's face had gone completely pale, and Gerald had already begun retreating quietly toward the ballroom's exit, clearly recognizing that his reputation, along with his ambitions, lay in ruins. "This gathering is not the appropriate venue for further discussion," the Duke announced firmly, addressing the surrounding crowd with unmistakable authority. "I trust everyone present now understands the truth behind tonight's unfortunate accusations. Lady Nora's character remains exactly as I have always known it to be: honest, resilient, and entirely without deception." As the crowd slowly began dispersing back into smaller conversations, buzzing with the scandal that would undoubtedly dominate society's gossip for weeks to come, Nora turned to find Victoria staring at her, with an expression unlike anything she had seen before. Not fury, but something closer to genuine, unguarded shock. "How did you become this person?" Victoria asked quietly, her voice stripped of its usual sharpness. "You were always so quiet, so easily dismissed. I never imagined you capable of standing against us so completely." "I was never incapable," Nora replied evenly. "I simply never had anyone willing to see my worth before now." Victoria said nothing further, turning instead to follow her mother, who had already begun making a hasty, humiliated exit from the gathering. Nora watched them go, feeling not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more settled, a sense of closure regarding a chapter of her life that had caused her nothing but pain for as long as she could remember. The Duke turned toward her, something unmistakably proud shining in his usually guarded eyes. "You handled that with remarkable grace," he said quietly. "I had an excellent teacher," Nora replied, allowing herself a small, genuine smile for the first time since arriving at the gathering. As the evening continued, and word of the scandal spread rapidly through every corner of the palace, Nora found herself receiving genuine warmth and respect from nobles who had previously regarded her with only curious suspicion. Whatever her family had hoped to accomplish through their elaborate scheme, they had instead accomplished the opposite, cementing Nora's reputation as a woman of remarkable strength and integrity, exactly as the Duke had always believed her to be. News of the gathering spread through the capital faster than anyone could have anticipated, and by the following morning, Blackwood Manor received a steady stream of correspondence from noble families eager to express their support for Nora and their outrage at the scheme orchestrated against her. Helena brought a fresh stack of letters to the breakfast table, her expression carrying a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. "It seems, my lady, that you have become quite the topic of admiration rather than scandal," Helena said, setting the letters down beside Nora's plate. "Several prominent families have requested formal introductions, eager to align themselves with someone who displayed such composure under pressure." Nora glanced through a few of the letters, still adjusting to the strange sensation of genuine respect after years of dismissal and neglect. "I never expected this outcome," she admitted. "I thought, at best, we might simply survive the accusations without lasting damage." "You underestimate yourself," the Duke said from across the table, his tone carrying quiet pride. "Society values strength and honesty, particularly when displayed against such transparent deception. You gave them exactly that last night." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another messenger, this one considerably less composed than the earlier correspondence had suggested. He delivered urgent news directly to the Duke, explaining that Lord Gerald Finch's creditors, emboldened by the public exposure of his financial troubles and fraudulent schemes, had descended upon his estate that very morning, seizing his remaining assets and effectively ending whatever social standing he had once maintained. "It seems Lord Finch's ambitions have collapsed entirely," the Duke remarked, reading through the detailed report with an expression of grim satisfaction. His creditors were merely waiting for sufficient justification to act against him. Last night's revelations provided exactly that. "And Margaret? Victoria?" Nora asked, uncertain whether she wanted to know the answer. "Their situation grows increasingly precarious as well," the Duke replied. "Several families who previously maintained cordial relationships with Ellison Hall have already begun distancing themselves, unwilling to associate with a household now publicly known for fabricating elaborate schemes against innocent parties. I suspect your former family will find themselves considerably isolated within noble society for the foreseeable future. Nora felt a complicated mixture of emotions at this news. Despite everything, despite years of cruelty and neglect, she found no genuine satisfaction in witnessing her family's downfall so completely. I did not wish for their complete ruin, she said quietly. I only wanted the truth acknowledged. Their downfall is entirely of their own making, the Duke reminded her gently. You bear no responsibility for the consequences of choices they made freely, choices motivated by cruelty and greed, rather than any provocation from you. Nora nodded slowly, understanding the truth in his words even as old. Complicated feelings continued swirling within her. Whatever pain her family had caused throughout her life, watching their carefully constructed world crumble so completely, still stirred something uncomfortable within her. A reminder that severing ties with one's own blood, however deserved, never came without emotional cost. In the days that followed, Nora found herself increasingly drawn into the responsibilities and rhythms of her new position within society. She attended smaller gatherings alongside the Duke, building genuine friendships with several noblewomen who had previously watched her rise with curious skepticism, but now approached her with authentic warmth and respect. She continued refining her management of Blackwood Manor's household accounts, earning quiet admiration from the estate's staff for her practical wisdom and genuine care for their well-being. Her relationship with the Duke, too, continued deepening steadily, each day revealing new layers of the man hidden beneath his once impenetrable composure. He began joining her for quiet walks through the manor's gardens each evening, sharing stories from his childhood, asking about her own memories, with genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. Small gestures of affection began appearing naturally between them, a hand resting gently at the small of her back as they walked, fingers brushing together during quiet conversations, glances held a moment longer than strictly necessary. One evening, as they walked together through the gardens beneath a sky scattered with stars, the Duke stopped suddenly, turning to face her with an expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen him display. Nora, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. She looked at him with genuine surprise. For what? For the manner in which I first claimed you, he said, choosing his words carefully. I acted decisively, publicly, and dramatically, believing at the time that such an approach would best protect you from your family's schemes and society's judgment. But I never properly considered how overwhelming and frightening that moment must have felt for you, how little choice I truly gave you in determining your own future that night. Nora considered his words carefully, appreciating the genuine remorse behind them. I understand why you acted as you did, she said finally. And while it is true that I felt overwhelmed and frightened that night, I have come to understand, through everything that followed, that your intentions were never selfish or careless. You saw value in me that no one else had ever acknowledged, and you acted to protect that value, even at the risk of your own reputation. That does not entirely excuse the manner in which I approached the situation, he insisted gently. Perhaps not entirely, Nora agreed, offering him a soft smile. But it does explain it, and understanding someone's reasons, even when their methods prove imperfect, matters a great deal to me. He studied her face for a long moment, something warm and unguarded shining in his eyes. You continue to surprise me, he said quietly. Every time I believe I understand the full measure of your character, you reveal another layer of grace and wisdom I had not anticipated. Perhaps that simply means we still have much to learn about each other, Nora replied, feeling a flutter of nervous anticipation building in her chest at the intensity of his gaze. I would like that very much, he said softly, reaching out to gently take her hand in his. I confess, Nora, that what began as a decision rooted in protection and admiration has grown into something considerably deeper than I ever anticipated feeling again, after everything my past taught me to fear. Nora's heart raced at his words, understanding the significance of such an admission from a man who had spent years building walls specifically to prevent himself from experiencing exactly this kind of vulnerability. I feel it too, she admitted quietly, though I confess it terrifies me almost as much as it comforts me. Why does it terrify you? He asked gently. Because I have spent my entire life believing myself unworthy of genuine affection, she said honestly. Learning to trust that what exists between us is real, rather than some temporary arrangement destined to end in disappointment, requires unlearning years of painful conditioning. The Duke reached up, gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face, with a tenderness that contradicted every rumor society had ever whispered about his supposed coldness. "I understand that fear intimately," he said. "But I promise you, Nora, whatever grows between us, I have no intention of allowing it to end in disappointment. You have already proven, through every challenge we have faced together these past weeks, that you possess a strength and integrity I have never encountered in anyone else. I do not intend to lose that, now that I have finally found it." Nora felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though they carried none of the pain and grief that had defined so much of her previous life. These were different tears entirely, born from the overwhelming realization that after years of rejection and neglect, she had finally found someone who valued her completely, without condition or hidden agenda. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, truly seeing me, when no one else ever bothered to look closely enough." "Thank you," he replied softly, "for teaching me that vulnerability, shared with the right person, need not lead to betrayal after all." They stood together beneath the star-filled sky for a long while after that, saying little more, simply existing together in comfortable, growing intimacy that neither of them had ever truly experienced before. Whatever challenges still awaited them, whatever remnants of scandal or family conflict lingered on the horizon, Nora understood with growing certainty that she had found, in this unlikely, once cold and distant Duke, a partner capable of matching her own resilience and depth of feeling completely. Nearly a month after the palace gathering, a carriage arrived unannounced at the gates of Blackwood Manor, and Helena hurried to inform Nora that Margaret herself had come, requesting an audience with an urgency that suggested something significant had prompted the visit. Nora's stomach tightened with apprehension as she made her way toward the manor's receiving room, uncertain what to expect after weeks of silence following the disastrous gathering. She found Margaret seated stiffly in a chair near the window, her once immaculate appearance now noticeably diminished, dark circles shadowing her eyes, and her clothing considerably less extravagant than Nora remembered. Gone was the sharp, calculating confidence that had defined her stepmother throughout Nora's childhood. In its place sat a woman who looked genuinely worn down by circumstance. "Margaret," Nora said cautiously, taking a seat across from her. "I did not expect to see you here." "I imagine not," Margaret replied, her voice lacking its usual haughty edge. "I would not have come at all, except that our circumstances have grown considerably desperate since the gathering." Nora waited silently, uncertain how to respond, watching as Margaret struggled visibly to find the right words. "Edmund's business partners have withdrawn their support entirely," Margaret finally admitted. "Several families who previously maintained friendly relations with our household have distanced themselves completely, and Victoria's prospects for any respectable marriage have been effectively destroyed by the scandal. We stand on the verge of losing Ellison Hall entirely." Nora felt a complicated tangle of emotions rise within her chest, old wounds mixing uncomfortably with a strange, unexpected sympathy she had not anticipated feeling. "I am sorry to hear that," she said carefully, "though I fail to understand what you believe I can do about your circumstances." "I have come to ask for your help," Margaret said, the admission clearly costing her considerable pride. "Not for myself, but for Victoria. She is innocent in much of what occurred. I orchestrated the scheme against you, convinced her to participate through promises of a favorable match. She bears responsibility for her role, certainly, but she was also manipulated, in her own way, by my ambitions." Nora considered this claim carefully, remembering Victoria's genuine shock during their final confrontation at the gathering, the way her composure had cracked so completely once the scheme unraveled. Perhaps there was some truth to Margaret's words, though it did little to erase years of casual cruelty Victoria had also inflicted upon her, independently. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Nora said finally. "A small settlement," Margaret admitted, "enough to secure Victoria's future independently, perhaps a modest property where she might live respectably, despite the damage to her reputation. I ask nothing for myself or Edmund. We accept the consequences of our own actions. But Victoria deserves a chance to build some kind of life beyond this scandal." Nora sat quietly for a long moment, weighing the request against everything she had experienced throughout her difficult childhood. Part of her wanted to refuse outright, to remind Margaret of every cruelty inflicted upon her over the years, every moment of neglect and dismissal that had shaped her into someone who once believed herself entirely unworthy of kindness. But another part of her, the part that had grown considerably over these past weeks under the Duke's steady influence, recognized an opportunity to demonstrate a different kind of strength entirely, one rooted not in revenge, but in genuine grace. "I will need to discuss this with the Duke," Nora said finally. "The decision is not mine to make entirely alone, given that any settlement would draw from resources belonging to Blackwood Manor. But I will present your request fairly, without allowing my own history with your family to color my recommendation unjustly." Margaret's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and for the first time in Nora's memory, she witnessed genuine, unguarded emotion from the woman who had spent years treating her with cold indifference. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. "I know I have no right to ask this of you, given everything I have done." "No," Nora agreed evenly, "you do not. But Victoria's situation is not entirely her own creation, and I do not wish to see her suffer indefinitely for choices you orchestrated on her behalf." After Margaret departed, Nora sought out the Duke immediately, explaining the conversation in full detail and watching his expression carefully as she relayed Margaret's request. He listened without interruption, his face carrying its usual careful composure, though something thoughtful lingered behind his eyes as she finished speaking. "What do you wish to do?" he asked finally. "I believe Victoria deserves some measure of consideration," Nora said honestly. "Not forgiveness exactly, for the cruelty she inflicted upon me over the years, but perhaps an opportunity to build a life separate from her mother's ambitions and manipulations. I do not believe punishing her indefinitely serves any genuine purpose beyond satisfying old grievances I would rather release." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering across his expression. "You possess remarkable grace," he said quietly. "Many in your position would seek considerably harsher consequences for those who wronged them so completely." "Perhaps," Nora acknowledged, "but I have spent enough of my life consumed by resentment and fear. I do not wish to carry that weight forward into whatever future awaits us. Granting Victoria a modest settlement costs us little, and it allows me to finally release this particular burden entirely. Then we shall provide it," the Duke said simply, "not as an admission of obligation, but as a demonstration of the character you have shown consistently throughout this entire ordeal." Arrangements were made quietly over the following days, a modest but sufficient settlement transferred discreetly to secure a small property for Victoria, far removed from the capital's judgmental society, where she might rebuild her life away from the scandal that had destroyed her prospects within noble circles. Margaret and Edmund, meanwhile, faced the full consequences of their diminished standing, their household gradually shrinking as they adjusted to a far more modest existence than they had ever previously known. With this final chapter of her difficult past finally resolved, Nora found herself able to focus entirely on the future unfolding before her at Blackwood Manor. Her relationship with the Duke had deepened considerably since their conversation in the gardens weeks earlier, each day bringing new moments of genuine intimacy and understanding between them. One crisp evening, as autumn began transitioning gradually into winter, the Duke requested that Nora join him for a private dinner within the manor's smaller, more intimate dining room, rather than their usual formal setting. She arrived to find the room decorated simply but beautifully, candles casting warm light across a table set for two, fresh flowers arranged carefully at its center, despite the late season. "This is lovely," Nora said, taking her seat across from him, curious about the unusual occasion. "I wanted tonight to feel different from our usual evenings together," the Duke explained, his expression carrying a nervous energy she had rarely witnessed from him previously. "There is something important I wish to discuss with you." Nora's heart began racing with anticipation, sensing the significance building steadily beneath his careful words. "I am listening," she said softly. The Duke reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his own. "Nora, when I first claimed you at that ceremony months ago, I acted out of genuine admiration for your character, built through years of quiet observation from a distance. I believed, at the time, that protecting you from your family's schemes and society's judgment represented the full extent of my intentions. And now?" Nora asked gently, though something in his expression suggested she already understood where this conversation was heading. "Now," he continued, his voice carrying an emotional depth she had never before heard from him. "I understand that what began as admiration has grown into something far deeper and more permanent than I ever anticipated experiencing again, after everything my past taught me to fear. You have shown me, through every challenge we have faced together these past months, a strength, grace, and genuine goodness that has fundamentally changed how I understand my own capacity for connection and love." Nora felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity radiating from every word he spoke. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "You saw value in me when no one else bothered to look closely enough, and in doing so, you taught me to see that same value within myself." The Duke rose from his chair, moving around the table to kneel gently beside her, producing a small ring from within his jacket, its design elegant but understated, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry favored by many noble families. "Nora Ellison," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind his words. "I have already claimed you before all of society as my intended. But tonight, I wish to ask you properly, without the pressure of ceremony or public expectation, simply as the man who has come to love you completely. Will you marry me? Not because circumstance or scandal demanded it, but because you choose this future for yourself, alongside me?" Nora's tears finally spilled freely down her cheeks, though they carried nothing but overwhelming joy and gratitude for everything the past months had brought into her life. "Yes," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I choose this future, and I choose you, completely, and without hesitation." He slipped the ring gently onto her finger, and as he rose to embrace her fully for the first time, Nora felt every remnant of her painful past finally settle into quiet peace, replaced entirely by the promise of a future built on genuine love, mutual respect, and the unshakable partnership they had forged together through every challenge life had presented them. Snow fell softly over Blackwood Manor on the morning of the wedding, blanketing the gardens in a pristine layer of white that sparkled beneath the pale winter sunlight. Inside, the manor buzzed with quiet, joyful activity, servants moving efficiently through final preparations, while Helena fussed over the last details of Nora's gown, with the pride of someone who had watched this transformation unfold from its very beginning. "I still remember the frightened girl, who arrived here months ago, barely able to believe her own good fortune," Helena said, adjusting the delicate lace along Nora's sleeve with careful, practiced hands. "Look at you now, my lady, a woman entirely transformed, ready to become Duchess of Blackwood in her own right." Nora studied her reflection in the tall mirror before her, hardly recognizing the confident, radiant woman staring back. Her gown, a deep ivory silk embroidered with delicate silver thread, fit her perfectly, and her hair had been arranged elegantly, adorned with small white flowers that Helena had gathered specifically from the manor's winter garden. "I could not have become this person without your guidance," Nora said softly, turning to embrace the older woman who had become far more than a mere housekeeper over these past months. "Thank you, Helena, for everything." "It has been my honor," Helena replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of pride and affection. "Now, come, your future husband awaits, along with half the nobility of this kingdom, eager to witness this remarkable union." As Nora made her way toward the manor's grand chapel, she passed familiar faces among the gathered guests, many of whom had become genuine friends over the past months, since the palace gathering's dramatic revelations. Noblewomen who had once regarded her with curious skepticism now smiled warmly as she passed, offering quiet words of congratulation and admiration for the strength she had displayed throughout her difficult journey. She spotted, near the back of the chapel, a small, unexpected addition to the guest list. Victoria stood quietly among the gathered crowd, dressed modestly compared to the extravagant fashions she had once favored, her expression carrying none of the sharp resentment that had defined her throughout Nora's childhood. When their eyes met briefly, Victoria offered a small, genuine nod, an acknowledgement of respect that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. Nora nodded back, feeling a quiet sense of closure settle over her. Whatever pain their shared history had caused, she found herself grateful that some measure of peace had finally been reached between them, allowing both women to move forward without the weight of old bitterness dragging behind them. At the front of the chapel, the Duke stood waiting, dressed in formal attire befitting the occasion, his expression carrying none of the cold, guarded composure that society had once believed defined him entirely. Instead, warmth radiated openly across his face as he watched Nora approach, his eyes never leaving hers throughout the entire ceremony that followed. The vows they exchanged carried genuine weight, each word chosen carefully to reflect the journey that had brought them together. From that dramatic, unexpected announcement months earlier, to this quiet, joyful culmination of everything they had built together since. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel erupted in genuine applause, far removed from the shocked, scandalized whispers that had greeted their initial engagement. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, filled with music, dancing, and genuine laughter that echoed warmly through Blackwood Manor's grand halls. Nora danced with her new husband beneath glittering chandeliers, feeling none of the fear and uncertainty that had once defined her relationship with grand social gatherings. Later that evening, as the celebration began winding down and guests slowly departed into the winter night, Nora found a quiet moment alone with her husband on the manor's private balcony, overlooking gardens blanketed in fresh snow beneath a clear, star-filled sky. "Do you remember?" she said softly, leaning against him as his arm wrapped naturally around her shoulders. "That first night, when you announced your choice in front of my entire family." "I remember it vividly," he replied, pressing a gentle kiss against her temple. The shock on every face in that room, the disbelief that a man known throughout the kingdom for his coldness would choose the daughter everyone else had dismissed and rejected. "I was terrified," Nora admitted. "I believed, for a moment, that some cruel joke was being played upon me, that I would soon discover the true reason behind your strange, sudden decision." "And now?" he asked, turning to study her face carefully in the soft moonlight. "Now," Nora said, smiling softly up at him, "I understand that you saw something in me long before I ever believed it existed myself. You saw worth in the girl everyone else had rejected, and in choosing me, you taught me to finally see that same worth within myself." "You always possessed that worth," the Duke replied gently. "I merely recognized what had always been true, long before circumstance finally allowed me the opportunity to act upon it." Nora leaned into his embrace, watching snowflakes drift gently down over the gardens below, feeling a peace and contentment she had never believed possible during the difficult years of her childhood. Whatever challenges still awaited them in the future, whatever responsibilities came with her new position as Duchess of Blackwood, she faced them now with genuine confidence, secure in the knowledge that she had finally found someone who valued her completely, without condition or hidden agenda. "I love you," she whispered softly, the words feeling entirely natural after months of careful, patient courtship that had transformed both their lives so completely. "I love you," he replied, his voice carrying a warmth that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had known him before Nora's arrival at Blackwood Manor. "Completely, and without reservation, for as long as we both shall live." As they stood together on that quiet balcony, wrapped in warmth despite the winter chill surrounding them, Nora reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her from a frightened, overlooked servant girl to the confident Duchess standing beside the man she loved completely. The rejection that had once defined her entire existence had, through circumstances neither of them could have fully anticipated, led directly to the greatest happiness either of them had ever known. Somewhere beyond the manor's walls, the kingdom continued its usual rhythms, unaware of the quiet, profound transformation that had unfolded within these grounds over the past months. But within Blackwood Manor itself, two people who had each been shaped by loss, rejection, and painful history had found, in each other, exactly the partnership and understanding they had both secretly longed for throughout their difficult lives. The girl once called rejected had become a duchess, cherished and respected throughout the kingdom, and the Duke once called cold had discovered, through her steady presence and unwavering character, that warmth and vulnerability, when shared with the right person, led not to betrayal, but to a happiness more profound than either of them had ever dared imagine possible. Their story, once the subject of shocked whispers and scandalous gossip throughout noble society, would be remembered instead as a testament to the idea that true worth is never determined by the judgment of others, but revealed fully only to those wise enough and patient enough to look beyond first impressions and discover the genuine character hidden beneath.